Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel Review Anything and Everything. Today we're just getting into a little bit of a rant, if you want to call it that, or just a topic of discussion in regards to recently they came out with the new Star Wars show, Maul Shadow Lord. And I don't know if any of you guys have been keeping up with that. I'm not going to really dive too much into the specifics of the show. Don't want to spoil anything, nor is this really about that. At least not in terms of talking about the show, like a review for the show or anything of that sort, but more so just in the sense that the layout of that world and this place called Janix, this planet called Janix, which I'm not one of those people who know a whole lot about Star Wars. So this was new to me. So I don't know if this is a planet that has been in lore from years ago. I'm sure it probably has. But I just thought it was very interesting looking at the imagery of the planet, the vibe of the planet. And that's kind of what we're going to get into today in terms of our discussion. And I wanted to have the backdrop of my kind of capital planet city backdrop that I had built previously with Lego bricks. Links gonna be in the description down below for all the parts that I use for all these, and even links in description to the reviews of these videos that I did for these two builds. But it was interesting because I remember at the time when I did those builds that it was the idea of, for someone who doesn't know that much as far as the deep lore of Star Wars, that Coruscant was the only really planet that had that vibe of like this, that very deep, rich city vibe, while having this clean political, kind of, I don't want to use the word peaceful, but just very clean and political and very like wealthy upper area. And then you had the underground area or the slums, which, just for a little background information, that was the build here for more of the upper area, which is why everything was on a platform height to simulate it being way up in the sky. And this was a simulation of my underground aspect, which you could relate it to Coruscant or any kind of fictional concept planet that you could think of if it came to like your own kind of space world. I didn't really say it was Star Wars, but it's like could be a generic space world, obviously modeled off of and inspired by that. Now, with Coruscant, though, what was interesting is it was a very dynamic location in which you had that upper area, very, very traditional when it comes to storytelling of the upper area relating to like the richer area, and then like the very lower area being like the slums, that kind of dynamic and traditional, I want to say, world building, where you had that kind of dynamic, though Coruscant takes it to a whole nother level. I'll get into that in a moment. But that kind of dynamic where you have things are very high rise, where everything is, you have it in Coruscant, but you also have that in things like, for example, it wasn't that, maybe it was like 2-3 years ago, they released the anime Arcane League of Legends on Netflix. If you've seen that, that's an example too, where the upper city is very wealthy, and the kind of lower area, the actual physical lower grounds going to this lower city was like the poverty area, a lot of pollution, very much of a steampunk vibe to it. And then you have other things too. I believe there's a small point in time where Fifth Element, like a small section of it in the movie Fifth Element, where you see Bruce Willis's character at home. You look outside his window. It gives you also that kind of vibe. Also, when he has the chase scene where it's like things on the upper area seem a little bit more regular, and then when you go down below, it's very like grimy and no one would be down there, whatever the case is. So you get the point that I'm trying to say. And so that was always like, that's a very, like I said, a kind of very normal structural layout for world building. Once people want to do that kind of storytelling, and it gives that kind of dynamic of like, the people who are in poverty versus the ones who are very wealthy. Now, and I think that's always interesting. What makes Coruscant a little different, though, is that Coruscant has these levels, and when you look at it on the surface, you don't see it like that in the movies, in the pictures, and any kind of display of it. you don't get the idea that it's more of like a stacked shelf type of situation, where if you imagine multiple shelves, the top surface of a shelf would be the first layer. The next layers going underneath are actually like a shelf. There's a rooftop above it where they're not seeing light. They're not seeing the surface like that. And then you keep going further down and further down. And I don't think a lot of people really knew that. I didn't know that until I started doing some more research on Coruscant when I was building these. And so bringing it back full circle to like Janix, though, very interesting. Janix seems to be this type of planet that gives you this vibe of like, similar to like Blade Runner, the original Blade Runner movie. Some people said it's kind of almost, they gave it a comparison to almost like a futuristic Gotham City. Very rundown, a lot of corruption. It does give you almost a vibe of underground Coruscant a little bit, but the difference is Coruscant's a little funny because sometimes it's depicted as even just the surface level, ground level of, so imagine super tall skyscrapers and super tall buildings that will have platforms on them like this, where you'll have things a little bit more upscale. And then just below that, and let's assume that this here being my kind of build simulation of the upper area and the lower area, just in general of like a space city and relating it to Coruscant, you wouldn't have to go to those under levels of the quote unquote shelf to see where necessarily like things were a little bit more poverty like. Just simply, if this is the upper level and that's the lower level, and these skyscrapers and all these kind of buildings are sitting on top of the upper layer of these like roofs, just imagine really tall and large structures, you would just simply have to get through the cracks of between here, drop down to this level, and you would see somewhat of an underground world just like that, which in the episode 2, when Anakin and Obi-Wan were chasing the bounty hunter, they didn't have to go through, at least to the best of my knowledge, they didn't have to go through any deep tunnels to get to just the ground level where you had those kind of nightclubs and where the bounty hunter went to hide. And that seems to be a little bit more like how Janix is built, where the upper higher levels, though they might seem a little bit more reasonable to live on, I didn't get the feeling within the show that it was necessarily upscale. So the whole show did feel a little bit more like Blade Runner to me, where everything feels like a little bit gritty, a little bit cyberpunkish type, not that kind of separation of dynamic between the higher up you go, the better it is, though I'm sure there's some level of that. But it wasn't hard to see the ground level either, because this wasn't built up like Coruscant. But I thought it was very interesting because for a lot of people who don't know that much on it, like myself, it's a new planet that's getting attention, that does have this city-like, industrial-like aspect to it, where a lot of times in Star Wars, you see a lot of planets that are similar to Tatooine. I forget the name of this other planet, but the one that was on, that's on Andor, like on the show Andor. I don't know the name of that city, that town where it starts off in, but you see a lot of those seem a little bit more like, not completely desert-like. They seem like they got a little bit more structures than Tatooine, but nonetheless, it gives you that kind of vibe. And there's a lot of stuff that's like that. You don't really see too many built-up city structure places in Star Wars that often, except for Coruscant. At least, like I said, not that hardcore fans would probably know more about, but just regular fans. So it's interesting that we're getting that kind of space, which kind of brings the point of, if you ever wanted to build, like cities, Star Wars type cities, if you're into the Lego space, whatever the case is, even though there's kind of a general talking point just on the subject in general, doesn't have to necessarily relate to Lego, but if you're into that space with Lego, it gives you a new place to kind of build on, something that has a different dynamic than Coruscant, while still giving you that city vibe that Coruscant gives you. And I just thought it was very interesting. I really find that planet very interesting. I like that layout. One difference is it feels like there is this layer of, I think people, when they compared it to Gotham City, is a good comparison, or I would even say, like I mentioned earlier, Blade Runner, because the original Blade Runner, because it has that very sense of like there's a lot of corruption, a lot of, you know, like things are a little bit ran down. And there's not as many high points in terms of like, you know, rich, at least not that they show on the show, on Darth Maul's show. They don't really show too many like high end locations, rich, wealthy locations. It feels like all over the place is this kind of very industrial, somewhat cyberpunkish, ran down type of environment, which is very appealing. It's very interesting. But it definitely doesn't have that dual identity going on like Coruscant has, where obviously from the movies really emphasized. You look at the Jedi Temple, you look at the what do you call those kind of political buildings, the Senate, and you know the all those kind of places, those political buildings and whatnot. They always tend to have like this kind of not only wealthy aspect to them, but almost like regal, like, or like, you know, like what's the word I'm looking for? Almost like royalty, like, or like king, like, you know, like times of like the knights and stuff like that, where it's a very old and kind of like where you have drapes everywhere. You know, you look at the Jedi Temple, you're walking in the inside, large red carpets, you got drapes along the windows, and you know, even the Senate buildings, you have the same thing, and it's very like everyone's walking around in robes, and they look like very expensive robes, you know, for that world, whatever. And whereas you know, you look at in the show, in Darth Maul's show on the planet Janix, I feel like you don't really see much of that going on. You don't really see too much, at least not that they showed and emphasized, but they've done I've seen maybe about 5 or 6 episodes now. They really don't really seem to show that there. So it's interesting. Like I said, so that makes the comparison very much a little bit more like Blade Runner's original movie, like wherever that took place in. I think that was LA, actually. I'm not too sure, like a future version of LA. Or, you know, something like a futuristic version of Gotham City, you know. So definitely it had that. And I say that to say like Gotham City because a lot of people view Gotham City as just very crime ridden, you know what I mean? You know, just high in crime. And I know it's supposed to be inspired by multiple different places. Obviously Gotham City is a fictional place, but inspired by multiple different big cities. But it always has this undertone of like constant crime and corruption going on. A lot of areas that are ran down, even though you do have some areas that are not. But for the most part, it still always had that kind of gritty feel to it, giving the purpose and essence of why Batman's there doing his thing. So that was definitely an essence that that is portrayed in it. Also, too, hand in hand with the fact that the law enforcement in it seems to be a lot more gritty, a lot more like Blade Runner is a perfect example. The law enforcement in that city feels similar to like Blade Runner, even though in Blade Runner, he's not a cop, he's like a bounty hunter. But if he was considered a cop, which to a degree, I think he is inside that for the most part. I mean, they do have blue and red lights on their cars. I can't remember off the top of my head if they were considered police or not, or just a branch of the police department. But nonetheless, that is the same feel that it feels like on Janix with law enforcement, where it's not like the equivalent of the Imperial military. It doesn't feel that way. It feels like traditional coffee drinking. It's futuristic, yes, because it's obviously it's space, but it's coffee drinking, you know, having a bad day, you know, we got to go out there and take care of these things. Doing street work, getting in contact with different mob or criminal bosses, having connection ties with them, getting so connected and familiar with them that you kind of now borderline being, you know, I'm not going to say necessarily bad, but that straddle that line between good and bad, where, okay, I'm gonna let some of my connections keep doing what they're doing because I know that like they're going to help me later on in line with other things I need to do. So it very much has that vibe going on, and which is not the vibe you get from any kind of law enforcement on Coruscant. At least that was ever displayed, you know, in any of the movies or any of the other media. But especially once the Empire took over, it became this vibe like the Empire was the police. And that still stays true into the show because the Empire is still always a looming threat that supersedes everything else. But just in the planet of Janix, it's just very interesting, that dynamic and the way they did with it. So I'm really fan of that. I'm a big fan of that. I'm glad that it gives a new planet to now be inspiration for people in the Lego hobby who wants to build little scenes of things like that, or just in general, whether someone's doing their own fan story writing or whatever the case is. It's just nice to have a new planet that brings this certain level of, you know, like a continuation of more city-like spaces. And when they brought the Mandalorian show into everything, which I believe was 2019, what was great about that is that you did have that whole bounty hunter going from, you know, planet to planet. It did have that nice vibe, but it was more of an exploratory vibe feel. And the city vibes were more, once again, very similar to Tatooine, in this kind of a more desert-like, small structures, not like tall skyscraper buildings, like the planet that he went on. I think it was called Navarro, if I had that right off the top of my head. Sometimes I forget these things, but I believe it was Navarro. Navarro, where it felt very desert-like, you know, some small structures that are maybe 1 to 2 stories high, you know, small little town areas, and then a lot of desert before you get to the next town area. So that became a mainstay. And so even in that show, the only time you saw like a city-like place was when they went to Coruscant, later point in times of the show. I don't know if it was in his show or in the Book of Boba Fett show, but they did show a point in time where, you know, they went back to Coruscant, and that was actually one of the inspirations for this build here with that little thing in the middle with the big tree I have there, was because you had that scene where they had that big rock in the middle of this open walkway area in Coruscant, which that whole, it was almost like an open, almost like a Central Park kind of area, or like a big like town square kind of park area with a little monument in the middle. In this case, it was this giant rock. I actually think that might have been the tip of a mountain, maybe, now that I think about it, but I'm not really too sure. And that's what I tried to do here. That inspiration was like this big tree that was in the middle. I had to reduce its size. It was bigger before, but I needed some space to kind of work with. You guys could see that inside the video that I had created this for, and then also in the review video where I talk about it. But anyway, so my point that I was getting at was, even in that show, or that collection of shows, I think it was, like I said, between The Mandalorian and Book of Boba Fett, which cross-reference, the only time you saw that kind of city aspect was coming back to Coruscant, where now you have this new planet that gives you another city aspect. I think that's very interesting. I think it's pretty cool. And it's different. It's definitely different, because it's surprising that in the Star Wars universe, you haven't had more cities like that, but you really haven't. One thing that's interesting that I totally forgot about a moment ago, but I'm going to kind of bring it back into frame now that it just came to my mind, is the skeleton crew and how they were on a planet that was more residential, like looked like your typical residential neighborhood type of vibe. That still didn't have that very strong city aspect to it, but that also was a different look. So it just goes to show you, for all the different places that they show in Star Wars, especially now that you have all these live actions, you've got the new Darth Maul, which is not live action, but nonetheless, great setup, great picture that it presents for you in terms of storytelling and whatnot, and atmosphere and world building. It's just interesting that all these different locations never really had a lot of city builds, especially for, you know, Star Wars being futuristic like, you know, I know it's set in its own time frame, not our time frame, but so futuristic like, and having all these kind of like it pretty much could be, it's one of the, I'm not gonna say pretty much, it is one of the founders of, what's the word I'm looking for? Cyberpunkish type of atmosphere, along with, like I said, movies like Blade Runner and Star Wars. Even though it didn't show that at that time, you knew it was within concept that it was there, because it was like a futuristic kind of environment. And in the expanded lore, all the books that came out for it, not that I ever seen them, I knew added that element to it. So it always was a part of Star Wars. But it's just interesting that even though it always was, it never showed it much. It never expanded on it. And there was only one planet that did that until now, really, for popular media until now. So that was just it. I just really wanted to kind of speak on that. And like I said, link's going to be description down below for these things. If you guys want to try to build them or have the inspiration to know how it was done, that way you guys can build something like this. So that way, if you want to build your own Janix, you can, because these are just representative of generic space capital cities, is what I called them, not necessarily particular to Star Wars specific planets, but inspired by. So feel free to check out those videos if you guys are interested in doing something similar. But like I said, very fascinating that we have this new planet that a lot of us never knew about, that brings us more lore to kind of build off of if you're in the Lego space, or just any kind of creative media space that you guys want to, whether it's writing and this and that, whatever the case is. In this case, we're just displaying Lego for the current topic. But as always, you guys, like, share, comment, subscribe. I'll catch you guys in the next video.